So here's the question I want to sit with. What if the game looks like a success, a genuine one, when you stop measuring it against the wrong yardstick? People keep trying to slot it into a box it doesn't fit, and then they grade it on how well it fills the box. If you walk into a jazz club expecting a symphony orchestra, you're going to have a bad time. It doesn't mean that jazz is bad. Now, there's a difference between a game that's rough around the edges and a game that doesn't know what it's doing. Crimson Desert knows exactly what it's doing. There's an implicit standard in a lot of preview and review coverage that rewards certain things very heavily. Polish, genre clarity, easy comparisons to existing successful titles, and a kind of market-ready confidence in the messaging. That signals that the frame is wrong, not the game. That's good. Crimson Desert launched last week, and within about 48 hours, the conversation about it split into two completely different realities. On one side, you've got players sinking hours into it, generally absorbed by the world, posting about exploration moments and sandbox systems and the sheer scale of what Pearl Abyss built. On the other side, you've got coverage that reads like the game failed some invisible test it was never actually trying to pass. And the gap between what Crimson Desert is doing and what certain corners of the gaming media seem to want it to be doing is what I want to talk about today. Because I think the coverage around this game gets a lot wrong. Not because the game is perfect, it isn't. I got my own list of things that need to work, but the framing, the lens through which a lot of journalists evaluate it, tells you more about the state of games criticism than it does about Crimson Desert itself. So here's the question I want to sit with. What if the game looks like a success, a genuine one, when you stop measuring it against the wrong yardstick? Let me be upfront about what I'm coming from. I played Crimson Desert. The world is generally impressive. The sandbox gameplay, the way the open world actually feels like a space you inhabit rather than a checklist you clear. The part is excellent. The story? Rough. And it's not really supposed to be a great story, per the PR person for Pearl Abyss. I'm not going to pretend that the narrative is where the game shines, and the combat, especially on mouse and keyboard, felt janky, and they have worked on actually fixing it through updates. It was noticeably better on controller, which tells you something about where the tuning was focused and where it still needs attention, which they did in the latest update. Pretty quick for a developer. But here's the thing, even with all of that on the table, if you're someone who's enjoying sandbox RPGs, if you like a world that rewards curiosity, and if you appreciate a developer that actively fixes issues fast, and Pearl Abyss has been patching aggressively since launch, then Crimson Desert is a genuine good time. It's a game with a clear identity and real ambition, and the rough spots feel like things that are being addressed, not things that define the ceiling. The problem is that a lot of press coverage doesn't engage with the game on those terms, and I think it's worth asking why. Here's what keeps happening with Crimson Desert in public discourse. People keep trying to slot it into a box it doesn't fit, and then they grade it on how well it fills the box. Some outlets treated it like it was supposed to be the next big cinematic action game, like it needed to compete head-to-head with the most polished, most linear, most tightly scripted experience in the market. Others approached it as basically Black Desert 2, a direct sequel to Pearl Abyss MMO, and then got confused and disappointed when the game didn't behave like that either. And still others just saw the trailers, which, to be fair, Pearl Abyss leaned heavily into spectacle with their marketing, and expected a blockbuster action title with a prestige story. When the game turned out to be something messier, something more systems-driven, something that lives in the space between genres rather than cleanly inside one, the coverage often treated that as a failure rather than a choice. But Crimson Desert is a hybrid, trying to be an open-world sandbox with action combat and a narrative thread running through it. That's a specific thing. It's not the same thing as a Souls-like, It's not the same thing as a traditional open world Ubisoft style game. It's not the same thing as a Black Desert Online. It has its own priorities. The world is the star, the systems are the draw, and the sandbox is the point. When you flatten all that into open world action games and then compare it to whatever the cleanest, most polished version of the phrase looks like in your head, you're going to come away disappointed. But that disappointed is a framing problem. It's a category error. It's the one that keeps showing up in coverage. I think part of this is on Pro Abyss. Their marketing emphasized cinematic moments and big set piece combat in ways that maybe oversold the spectacle angle and undersold the sandbox identity. But the other part is on gaming journalists who didn't do the work of figuring out what kind of game this actually is before deciding whether it succeeded. If you walk into a jazz club expecting a symphony orchestra, you're going to have a bad time. It doesn't mean that jazz is bad. Now, let's talk about the rough edges, because they're real. I'm not here to pretend otherwise. The combat on PC with mouse and keyboard, it still needs some work. It's getting better, but there is jankiness and a lack of responsiveness in certain animations that you feel immediately. On controller, it's a meaningful, better experience, which suggests the combat system itself has something great for it, but the PC input layers wasn't there, given enough attention before launch. The story, like I said, is the weakest part of the package. The narrative beats don't land the way they need to for a game that clearly wants you to care about its characters and its world on an emotional level. There are optimization issues on PC that affect the experience in ways that matter. Framing, pacing, performance dips in dense areas, the kind of things that pull you out of the moment. All of that is true, but here's what I think the coverage goes sideways. There's a difference between a game that's rough around the edges and a game that doesn't know what it's doing. Crimson Desert knows exactly what it's doing. The world design is deliberate, the sandbox system are coherent, the exploration works, and the way encounters are structured in the open world, the way the game rewards you for going off the beaten path, none of that is accidental. There is a design vision here that is specific and ambitious, and in a lot of places generally well executed. When you look at the combat, even with its jankiness, you can see what they're going for. The variety of weapons, the different fighting styles interact with the world, the ambition to make combat feel weighty and physical, the intent is clear even when the execution isn't fully there yet. And Pro Abyss has been patching. They've been responsive. The game that exists today is already different from the game that existed on launch day. And the trajectory suggests they're serious about closing the gap between what they're aiming for and what players are experiencing. But a lot of the coverage I read treated the roughness as it was the whole story, as if a janky animation or a frame rate dip or a clunky cutscene meant the entire project was misguided. And that's just not a fair reading. You can acknowledge that the story needs work and that the PC version needs optimization and still recognize that the core of the game, the world, the sandbox, the systems, is strong. Those two things can coexist. Roughness and vision are not mutually exclusive. The best way I can put it, Crimson Desert feels like a game that was released at maybe 80% of where it's going to end up. And for a lot of players, 80% of this particular vision is already more interesting than 100% of something generic. That's not a defense of shipping unfinished work. It's an observation about the work is actually trying to accomplish and how much of it is already working. That brings me to the broader point about how gaming journalists evaluate projects like this. And I think this is where the conversation really gets interesting. There's an implicit standard in a lot of preview and review coverage that rewards certain things very heavily. Polish, genre clarity, easy comparisons to existing successful titles, and a kind of market-ready confidence in the messaging. If a game looks clean, fits neatly into a known category, and can be described in one sentence that references two other games people already like, it tends to get favorable, easy coverage. And early coverage, too. If a game is messier than that, if it's harder to recognize or even categorize, if it's ambitious to create visible friction, if the developer is doing something that doesn't map clearly out what came before, The coverage often reads as skeptical or dismissive, even when the underlying game might be doing something more interesting than the polished, easily categorized alternative. Crimson Desert ran into this. It's not easy to describe in one sentence. It doesn't fit neatly into a genre box. Its ambition creates visible friction. The combat is trying to do a lot. The world is enormous and system dense. The narrative is attempting to weave through a sandbox in a way that's inherently harder to pull off than a linear story. All of that makes it harder to cover in a preview cycle that rewards certainly a clean messaging. And I think this is something worth naming directly. The way a lot of games journalists work right now, the incentive structure rewards being right quickly more than it rewards being right eventually. If you can call a game a hit or a miss within the first few hours, then a faster story, a faster headline, and faster take. But games like Crimson Desert, games that are system dense, that reveal their strengths over time, that are being actively improved by their developers, those games don't give you the fast, clean verdict. They ask you to sit with them. They ask you to evaluate the trajectory, not just the snapshot. And a lot of outlets just aren't set up for that. The review cycle, the preview cycle, the content cycle, they all push towards quick, definitive judgment. Is it good or is it bad? Is it a hit or a flop? And when I see a game like Crimson Desert land in the middle of that cycle with a mix of genuine strengths and real weaknesses, the tendency is to resolve the ambiguity in one direction. So, how are we going to be able to speak with this honestly? And what I've seen with Crimson Desert is a lot of the press revolved around ambiguity towards skepticism. The rough edges become the story, the jankiness becomes the headline, and the things that make the game genuinely distinctive, the world building, the sandbox depth, the ambition of the design, got treated as secondary and as nice to haves that didn't outweigh the problems. But talk to the players. Talk to the people who are actually spending time in the game. The conversation is completely different. It's not that players are ignoring the flaws. They're not. The subreddits and forums are full of specific detailed feedback and combat feel and PC performance and narrative pacing. But the overall sentiment is that the game is worth playing, worth investing in, worth following. Because the core of the experience is strong enough to carry the rough edges while Pearl Abyss works on them. That gap between the press narrative and the player experience is not unique in Crimson Desert, but it's especially visible here, and I think it reveals something about the limitation of how the game gets covered. When the standard of success is polished and genre clarity and easy messaging, you're going to have systematic undervalue games that are ambitious and messy and original, and I think that's exactly what happened here. Not to mention that the game went from mixed when it launched to positive, all in a few updates. So it's worth mentioning as well. So let me bring this to a point. Why is Crimson Desert already a success? Not because it's flawless, not because every system works perfectly, not because the story is great, or the PC version is optimized, or the combat doesn't need tuning. It's a success because it's established a clear identity in a market that is drowning in games that feel like other games. It's a success because the sandbox, the actual core of the experience, the thing you spend most of your time doing, is genuinely compelling. It's a success because the world Pearl Abyss has built is one of the most interesting open world games I've explored in a while. Not because of graphical fidelity or map size, but because of the way it's designed to reward engagement. It's a success because the developer is showing up. Pearl Abyss has been patching aggressively. They've been responding to feedback. The trajectory of the game since launch has been visibly upward, and if you know anything about Pearl Abyss's track record with Black Desert Online, you know they're capable of long-term support and iteration. That matters. A game that launches at 80% and is being actively pushed towards 90-95% is a different proposition than a game that launches at 80% and stays there. And it's success because the player who actually engages with it, the people who gave it a fair shot, who approach it as what it is rather than what they expect it to be, are having a good time. Not a perfect time, a good time. The kind of good time where you keep playing, where you keep exploring, and where you find yourself thinking about the game when you're not playing it. That's not nothing. In a market that is crowded, that's actually rare. The dismissal from certain corners of games media doesn't change any of that. If anything, it reinforces the point. When the criticism is mostly about the game not being what the critic expected, rather than about the game failing at what it's actually trying to do, that signals that the frame is wrong, not the game. Crimson Desert doesn't need to win every argument that journalists brought to it. It doesn't need to be the most polished game of